House of the Dragon just dropped the trailer for Season 3, Episode 3, and after Episode 2 gave us the fall of King's Landing, Otto Hightower's execution, and Rhaenyra finally sitting on the Iron Throne, this is the first real look at what kind of queen she's actually going to be. This episode is also a genuinely big one, because it marks the 100th episode across the entire World of Westeros franchise, once you count Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon, and A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. So there's a lot riding on this hour, and the trailer is dense. Let's break it down piece by piece, because there's a lot more going on here than just dragons and politics. There's some real psychological stuff happening with Rhaenyra, and a couple of threads I want to give you my own read on, because I don't think the surface-level explanation is the full story. The trailer opens with tense, almost suffocating music underneath Rhaenyra, and the first thing we hear her say is that all eyes now look to her, and that she must justify her father's faith in her. Right away, that's doing two things at once. It's telling us she knows the entire realm is watching to see if she cracks, and it's also quietly setting up a theme of legacy and inheritance, because she's not just trying to be a good queen for queen's sake. She's trying to prove that Viserys was right to break tradition in the first place by naming his daughter as his heir. That's a lot of weight to be carrying into your very first scene as monarch. We also get a close-up of her hand gripping the Iron Throne, and I think that shot is doing more than just showing nerves. After everything she's lost to get here, both of her sons, among other things, that grip reads to me like she's almost confirming to herself that it's real, that this is actually hers now, while also physically holding onto the one thing that's supposed to make all of it worth it. From there, we move into the Red Keep itself, and it's clear the city she's inherited is a mess. We hear fragments of people bringing her problems, something about control, someone begging her pardon, a mention of the bedchamber, and a council member flatly warning her that her resources are small and her hazards are many. That line is doing a lot of work, because it's not exaggeration. King's Landing right now is genuinely unstable. Aegon fled the castle rather than face capture. Alicent has effectively stepped back from wanting any part of ruling, and on top of that, Rhaenyra has just had to execute her own father-in-law figure in front of the city. Plus, several other lords loyal to the Greens were dealt with the same way. There's also the detail that Aegon didn't go quietly into hiding alone. He left with Larys Strong, which honestly might end up being one of the more dangerous loose threads of the season, because Larys is not someone you want whispering in the ear of a deposed king with a grudge. So Rhaenyra isn't just inheriting a throne, she's inheriting a half-collapsed government with an absent rival who could resurface at any moment, and a council that barely functions. That's the many hazards the trailer is warning us about, and I think it's smart that the show is choosing to spend an episode on the unglamorous, exhausting part of taking power instead of jumping straight into more battles. It's also worth remembering exactly how she got here, because I think it colors every scene in this trailer. Rhaenyra only learned her son Jacaerys was dead at the very start of Episode 2, and by all accounts, she didn't take that news quietly. She reportedly refused to accept it at first, demanding answers from a body that obviously couldn't give her any. That's the emotional state she's walking into this new role with, barely processed grief stacked directly underneath the weight of a crown. Then within the same episode, she's forced to stand over Otto Hightower, Alicent's own father, and make the call to have him executed, doing it herself rather than delegating it to a guard. So by the time Episode 3 opens, she's lost a son, ordered an execution of someone close to her oldest friend, and inherited a city that doesn't fully trust her yet. That's not a triumphant coronation. That's someone running on fumes and forcing herself to look steady anyway. And I think that's exactly what that opening close-up on her face is meant to communicate. On top of the city itself being unstable, her own small council isn't really a functioning council yet either. Daemon, who's supposed to be one of her closest allies, just made a fairly significant unilateral callback at Harrenhal, leaving only a token garrison behind while he marched the bulk of his Riverlander forces to help retake King's Landing. He also dismissed Alice Rivers when she asked to be granted Harrenhal outright as payment for her help, brushing her off in a way that, knowing this show, is going to come back around. None of that has reached Rhaenyra yet as far as we know. But it means she's building her reign on a foundation that already has cracks in it that she doesn't even know exist. Before I get into the part of this trailer that I think is actually the most important reveal of the whole season so far, I want to flag something for you. A lot of the details people are going to be talking about this week, the Daeron reveal, the fake Daeron twist, what's actually happening with Aemond at Harrenhal, none of that was in the main trailer everyone saw first. HBO has been quietly dropping a second wave of confirmation through cast interviews and short teaser clips in the days right after each episode airs, and most of it disappears from people's feeds within 48 hours. Episode 4 lands in roughly a week, and historically, that's not a lot of runway to catch everything before the next episode drops and spoils the conversation for you anyway. If you'd rather see the breakdown land in your feed the moment it's ready, instead of digging for it after the fact, subscribing with notifications on is genuinely the only way that happens automatically. Okay, back to the trailer. Now here's the big one. On the battlefield, we see Otto Hightower standing with the full might of his army, and across from him is Daemon, alone or close to it, with Caraxes looming behind him. It's a deliberately lopsided visual, Daemon massively outnumbered yet somehow still the more menacing presence in the frame, which tells you everything about how the show wants us to read his confidence. Daemon then tells Rhaenyra directly that Daeron Targaryen is a claimant to the throne, and that she's going to have to deal with him. For longtime viewers, this is a genuinely huge moment, because Daeron is Viserys and Alicent's youngest son, and he has never once appeared on screen across 2 full seasons. He was sent off to Oldtown specifically so he'd be safe and available to press a Hightower claim later if needed. And later has officially arrived. We get our first ever look at him here, alongside his dragon Tessarion, surrounded by Hightower soldiers. But here's the twist that I think changes the entire calculation, and it's confirmed, not speculation on my part. The footage shows Ormond presenting this Daeron to Daemon, and it's being framed as a fake. The Greens are using a decoy. Think about what that actually means strategically. If Daemon kills this boy, or even just threatens him into giving up information, he's potentially executing an innocent stand-in while the real Daeron, and his real dragon, stay completely hidden and unaccounted for somewhere else. That's not just a twist for shock value, that's the Hightowers fighting back with the one weapon Rhaenyra's side doesn't have an answer for yet, which is misinformation. My own theory here is that this decoy is going to buy the Greens enough time to either smuggle the real Daeron somewhere Rhaenyra's dragons can't reach, or to wait until Rhaenyra's side is overconfident and strike with the real claimant when nobody's expecting a second Daeron to exist. Either way, I don't think this storyline is over after one trailer reveal. I think it's just getting started, and I'd bet the real Daeron resurfaces later in the season, specifically when the Blacks think that threat has already been neutralized. Think about it from Otto Hightower's position for a second, too. He's commanding what is genuinely the largest standing army in Westeros, and his entire purpose at this point is keeping a Hightower-blooded claimant attached to the Iron Throne by any means necessary. Sacrificing a decoy costs him nothing and tells him a great deal, because however Daemon reacts to that boy is information. Does Daemon hesitate? Does he kill without checking? Does Rhaenyra order restraint? Every one of those outcomes tells Ormond something useful about how the Blacks intend to handle the real Daeron when he eventually does surface, which makes this less of a one-off twist and more of a calculated probe. That's the kind of long-game thinking I don't think the marketing wants you to clock on a first watch, but once you notice it, it reframes the entire battlefield scene from a simple confrontation into something closer to a chess opening. Now, let's talk about Alicent, because her lines in this trailer are doing some of the heaviest lifting emotionally. She tells Rhaenyra that she may not rule and remain herself, that there is a door inside her that must shut. Then later she says Rhaenyra will do things her heart would have recoiled from. Given everything that's just happened between them, Rhaenyra having executed Alicent's own father, this isn't coming from a place of comfort. It almost sounds like a warning dressed up as sympathy, and it lines up with something from the source material that's worth knowing. In Fire and Blood, Rhaenyra's reign after taking the throne is described in pretty harsh terms, with one contemporary account going so far as to nickname her a vindictive woman, calling her something close to King Maegor with teats, referencing one of the cruelest kings in Targaryen history. Given how the show has actually portrayed Rhaenyra so far, careful, conflicted, reluctant to spill blood unless cornered, I don't think the show is going to lean into that nickname literally. But I do think Alicent's warning is the show's way of acknowledging that history exists, almost daring the audience to wonder whether this version of Rhaenyra ends up there too, even if the path looks different. We then get the trailer's most visually striking sequence, Rhaenyra standing and watching as symbols of green rule are destroyed and burned, her expression shifting into something colder than we've seen from her before. I don't think this is random anger. I think this is the show visually marking the moment where the queen we knew, the one who spent 2 seasons trying to avoid war altogether, starts to give way to someone willing to be ruthless to hold what she's won. That's consistent with what showrunners and the cast have said about this stretch of the season, that taking the throne and keeping the throne are framed as two completely different challenges, and the second one is the one that's going to cost her something. There's also a thread I want to bring in that wasn't directly in the trailer footage we just walked through, but that I think is essential context for understanding the state Rhaenyra's small council is actually in going into this episode, and it's one of my own predictions for how it pays off. At the end of episode 2, Aemond took Harrenhal from Daemon's abandoned garrison, killing Sir Simon Strong and his sons in the process, but he took a serious knife wound doing it. The episode ended with him collapsing in front of Alice Rivers, Harrenhal's healer, begging her to save him, his fate left open. Daemon had already turned Alice down when she asked to be granted Harrenhal for her loyalty, so she's got every reason to consider switching her allegiance to whoever's standing in front of her now. What makes this genuinely interesting, rather than just another wound and recover beat, is what the actors themselves have hinted at. Both Ewan Mitchell and Gail Rankin have described the dynamic between Aemond and Alice as something closer to a dark, complicated romance than a simple healer and patient arrangement, and there's already a version of this relationship in the source material where the two of them become involved with each other, with real consequences down the line. Daemon's own scenes with Alice last season followed a pattern of her offering visions and influence in exchange for protection and standing, and there's no reason to think her approach with Aemond will look fundamentally different, except that Aemond, unlike Daemon, has shown he's far more willing to be controlled by anyone who flatters his sense of destiny. My theory is that this is exactly what happens. I think Alice nurses Aemond back from that wound, rather than letting him die, not out of kindness, but because keeping him alive and indebted to her is the only leverage she has left after Daemon dismissed her. If that's the play, it puts one of the most dangerous dragon riders in Westeros under the influence of someone whose loyalties nobody on either side can actually predict. That's a problem neither the Blacks nor the Greens are prepared for, and I don't think the writers introduced that cliffhanger just to resolve it quietly off-screen. If anything, I'd expect Harrenhal to quietly become its own third faction this season, answering to nobody but Alice herself, with Aemond as the weapon she's chosen to point. The trailer closes on Alicent, alone, telling Rhaenyra that time will tell. It's a short line, but it lands like a quiet threat, rather than reassurance, which fits everything else she says in this preview. Given that the alliance she and Rhaenyra built last season is basically broken now that Otto is dead, I think we're watching the last thread of their friendship fraying in real time. And time will tell might be the closest thing to a goodbye these two characters get for a while. So here's where I land on episode 3. Rhaenyra spends this hour discovering that holding the throne is a completely different fight than winning it, surrounded by a council that's barely functioning, a half-empty city, and a council member literally telling her how few resources she actually has. Daemon forces her into her first real wartime decision as queen with the Daeron situation, except the decision she thinks she's making isn't the real one, because the Hightowers have already swapped the pieces on the board. Alicent is pulling away from her, possibly setting up to becoming an obstacle rather than an ally. And over at Harrenhal, Aemond's survival is now tied to a woman whose motives nobody actually understands, which could end up reshaping the entire back half of the season in a direction nobody's predicting yet. If you've been tracking the Fire and Blood source material, I'd genuinely love to know in the comments whether you think the show is steering toward that harsher, more ruthless version of Rhaenyra the book hints at, or whether you think this is build up to her finding a different way to hold power without becoming that. I read through a lot of theories putting this together, and the split on that question is honestly close to even, which tells me the show has done a good job keeping this genuinely uncertain instead of obvious. That kind of back and forth in the comments is actually the most useful part of putting these breakdowns together, because it usually points me toward the detail I missed the first time through. So if you got a theory that goes against what I just laid out, that's exactly the kind of thing worth dropping below. And if you want the next one of these waiting for you the moment episode 4's trailer lands, rather than stumbling across it days later, subscribing is what makes sure that happens. House of the Dragon Season 3, Episode 3 premieres July 5th on HBO and HBO Max.